Hi everyone. So we were told 10-minute presentations, so excuse us if there's a bit of a rush at the end. I've come from the University of Warwick, and a lot of the work I write about is in terms of how responses to crises have happened, and often around kind of racism and other kinds of crises where the response is often around community and that there's a need for community. So I was asked to talk about why are we talking about community when we're talking about hate crime. So there's a summary. I think you've got a copy of the slides. I'll go through each of these questions during the talk, so you don't need to memorize those or anything. But my first point is to think about how often government, in particular, responses to hate crime or to a crisis which relates to kind of tensions and community divisions is to think about community cohesion or coming together. And a recent example of that, which I've been writing about and thinking about recently, was the murder of Jo Cox MP. So she was murdered by a white supremacist and misogynist, and I don't know if you're going to be talking about the classification of misogyny as a hate crime or not, but in this case, she was a white woman, but she was attacked by the killer, thinking that she was in favour of refugees and an anti-racist. Whether or not, however much she did or didn't do around that, that's why he murdered her. And the response, of course, led by her family and friends, was around this More Uncommon campaign. So I'm not criticising the idea that having community picnics is a good thing to do and a nice thing to do, but generally it might not be the thing that deals with the politics behind hate crime. So having street parties and a very successful kind of gatherings, albeit sometimes organised during Ramadan without really thinking that through, are fine. But my question is, can you fight hate crime with picnics? And that's very simplified, I know, but in 7 minutes, that's what I'm going to say. So coming together, sharing food is a good thing to do. Perhaps it brings understanding and familiarity, but does it deal with the reason that somebody felt moved to go and kill Jo Cox, or why people feel moved to attack others in the street? So some of the problems with this, this idea of like we need to come together around community, depends on a very vague definition of what we mean by community. So there's no time to show you this, but there's a link to a film from the More in Common and Great Get Together campaign, which you could watch later, which is fronted by Helen Mirren, talking about what unites us as a country. So this was about getting people to go to and organise great get-together picnics. And again, it's nice stuff that people share. It's lots of celebrities talking about things that people have in common, like people like cake, people like toast and Marmite, and people like James Bond, and sports. That's great, but it doesn't really address the question of why somebody would kill someone else in the street. So what I'm trying to push the conversation onto is how it still retains an idea of us as a country that has some people outside of it, and it doesn't address where will that kind of hatred come from. The other question around pushing back to communities, and communities need to get together and be nice to each other, is that it leaves out the role that governments and other institutions have in creating division, resentment and hatred. So this quote here is from a social theorist called Sarah Ahmed, where she says, "The reduction of racism to the figure of the racist allows structural or institutional forms of racism to recede from view." So basically what she's saying is, if we single out one white supremacist, one suicide bomber, one brutal attack in the street, that person is the problem. She's not saying that person isn't a problem, but it leaves out how did that all come to happen in the first place, and that we need to really think about where that came from. And to illustrate that, you might think about how the Daily Mail, which is famously its founder wrote in support of the Nazis in the 30s, but also constantly has anti-migrant headlines and various questionable things which have been linked to hate. But was campaigning to have the murderers of Stephen Lawrence jailed, and did put this picture of the murderers from that very significant hate crime that wasn't investigated properly on its front page, and asked for the blame to be taken. But if they're making it about these people and perhaps particular people in the police, where was their role in enabling that kind of conversation to happen, which may have enabled these guys to get to that space or not? And finally, the other problem with communities is that the idea of community can exclude as well as include. It can be a dangerous space as well as a safe space. So I'm sure you've also already talked about this a bit. But the example I was going to use is around the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities, who were often responded to, who are the group that faced the most hate, in the most kind of racism in the UK. And these are all headlines from local papers from this month. And a lot of the debate, and there was a debate in Parliament in the last couple of weeks around how planning can address the needs of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities having encampments. The response is often that the local community, it's not good for the local community for these people to have somewhere to live. So it frames community as a division where some people are included and some people's lives matter more than others. So we need to think critically about what community means when that's used. So what do we do instead? So in 7 minutes. One alternative of thinking through how people can be together and work together against crime and unite is to think about solidarity rather than cohesion, to think about action and power relations rather than simple answers about we all come together and we all like toast. So what might that mean? This is a quote from an African-American poet called June Jordan, writing about a hate crime in 1999, I think, in LA, where a white supremacist went to kill, said he told the police he was out hunting for Jews, and he went to shoot people up at a synagogue. He actually shot a Latino man dead. And as an African-American bisexual woman, she felt she was under threat just as much as the Jews he said he was hunting for. So her response was, we have to make these targets when we, each individually, can become targets for hate. We should be targets for opportunity for challenging that hate. So she went in solidarity to spend time with the Jewish community. Other examples might be challenging hate crimes on buses. As you've seen, all sorts of examples of that are often picked up on social media. Or you may remember the film Pride, about the lesbian and gay support the minors campaign from the 1980s, where lesbian and gays who were particularly under attack in the 80s from hate crime actually did take action, which was about power relations and challenging what was going on for the minors through raising money, and which led to labour organisations supporting LGBT causes. So thinking about the politics of this rather than simply about picnics would be my main advice. Thank you.
Thank you.